Black Muslim thought and Black Muslim joy. My name is Zarisha, and I will be your MC for this event alongside Nasreen. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that most of us are currently on the unceded and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katzie, Kwikwetlem, Kaikat, and Tsawwassen First Nations, and we're grateful for their generosity in having us here on these lands. This event was organized by the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies at SFU in partnership with Open City Events. I am part of Open City Events, and Open City Events is a youth-based group in Surrey, BC that works towards social good and raises awareness for humanitarian crises that are happening around the world. We are a cooperative that's run under Solid State Community Industries, which is a non-profit that's based in Surrey. We would appreciate if you could take the time to check us out on Instagram, Facebook, which is all at Open City Events, and our website, which is opencityevents.ca. And in the past month, we have organized 3 events with CCMS, which are like online iftars. They have been about Islam and the environment, Muslim spaces, and also Muslim feminism in partner. And these have, as I mentioned, all been in partnership with CCMS. We also have another event coming up soon with CCMS, so stay tuned for that. Yeah, Aslam, would you like to now speak to us a little bit about CCMS?
Sure. CCMS is based out of the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies, based out of Simon Fraser University, and we are here to encourage the public understanding of the complexity of Muslim communities and societies, and try to move away from the single representation of Islam as a religion to the multiplicity and complexity of Muslims as a very dynamic and diverse group of people who may practice that religion in a number of different ways.
Okay, thank you, Aslam, for sharing that. My name is Nasreen, and I'll also be your second MC. And now I think we can get into a little about why we felt it was so necessary to organize this event and what we want to achieve coming out of it. And I also have my notes here to the side, so bear with me if my eyes wander that way. So our goal for this event was to allow for an honest and wholesome discussion that entails the Black Muslim experience in our community. In the past few weeks, we have seen just a glimpse of the way the discrimination and violence that Black people face in many parts of the world. And we have seen awful acts of police brutality and the horrible murders of many Black civilians. Just a few of the names were George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and these were all deaths that were preventable. None of these people deserved the fate that befell them, really. They were just unjustly criminalized for the reason of just the color of their skin. And many such incidents of racism are not captured or made public, but happen to the day-to-day. So they happen daily in our everyday surroundings. And as a result of these incidents, we have seen mass protests as a reaction to the inhumane acts of police brutality and the growing momentum to the Black Lives Matter movement. So inshallah, this event aims to, it's a conversation that will be led by Bashirah Mack in the context of the incredible urgency for Black Lives Matter organizing across the globe. Black Muslim thought creates the foundation for Black Muslim joy, which is a form of resistance to anti-Black racism. Therefore, critical in the time of Black Lives Matter. This event will use the power of storytelling to provide insights into the moment we're in using the framework of Black Muslim thought and Black Muslim joy. It builds on centuries-old philosophies to consider new forms of resistance and solidarity.
Thank you, Nasreen. Now I'm just going to explain what the next hour and a half is going to look like. So our speaker, Bashirah, she's going to talk for about till 6:55. And once she's done, we're going to split everyone into breakout rooms where you're going to have a chance to talk about a little bit about what you learned. And if you have, in that time, you were to come up with like 1 to 3 questions that you would like to ask her. And then once we come back, we'll share all of those questions, and you have a chance to ask Bashirah. We are very honored to have her here as a speaker today. Bashirah Mack is a journalist who is most inspired by the unique experiences of being Black and Muslim in the United States with roots in the American South. Bashirah was born and raised in a close-knit, predominantly Black American Muslim community. She is also the descendant of enslaved men and women who were among the first Muslims in the United States. Bashirah's love for storytelling, Islam, and Black folks led her to her foundational work with the Sapelo Square, an award-winning platform that produces, documents, and archives the Black Muslim experience in the United States. Since then, she has gone on to report and produce more broadly for a number of other media, including NPR affiliate stations. And now, as a student at the University of California's Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, she hopes to use documentary filmmaking to tell those stories and more. Bashirah received a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science with minors in Black World Studies and Islamic World Studies from Loyola University, Chicago. So let's welcome Bashirah.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. And thank you all from Open City Events, from the Center of Comparative Muslim Studies at Simon Fraser for inviting me. And thank you all who are joining us on Zoom. I know some of you are in other time zones. So I know it could be a little bit late, but thank you for being here and sharing this space with me. So there's a lot of ways to sort of approach this conversation, but as a storyteller, I think the best way for me to approach it is through storytelling. So this evening, I'm going to be talking about Black Muslim thought, Black Muslim joy, what they mean and what they can look like as resistance to anti-Black racism. And as I said, I'm going to try to do that through my own personal stories and experiences, what it was like for me to grow up in a Black American Muslim community. And I stress just that adjective as American because you can be Black and you can be Black and Muslim in many different contexts depending on your history, your ethnic background, and several other factors. But for the purposes of my talk about my personal experience, I'm going to focus on just the Black American Muslim community that I came from. And that was a community that informed my values and introduced me to these concepts before there was sort of this current terminology that we're using. And another reason, like why I want to start with storytelling is because storytelling can be transformative and empowering, both for the speaker and for the audience. It necessitates that we listen. And once we listen, we can begin to learn, question, and even critique the information. And storytelling also provides experiences that we may otherwise not have access to or have considered. And storytelling can be a catalyst and empower informed action on the part of the listener and allow them to build in community with others. So all this as we navigate the present moment where more people are working to sort of organize against anti-Black racism in the time of Black Lives Matter. So with that, I will begin. I can't remember a time where I wasn't fully Black and fully Muslim. In fact, I was very Black and very Muslim. And I grew up in a community that reflected just that. It was neither either or. It was always both and. From the Ummis and the Abbeys and their long kimars and fitted kufis to the young boys and girls trying to match their parents' cool. I credit the elders in my community for trying to model this and affirm us too. These people, my community elders, they were architects of a special kind, carrying with them a special vision at a very complicated time. I mean, try building a community from scratch, where your children can know who they are, where they don't have to negotiate their identity in a country where you and they were born. I mean, really, try building a community where your children are safe from harm, where state surveillance is a fact and an ever-growing norm. Try creating new traditions, ones your parents didn't have. Try slaughtering sheep freed in the hood off the boulevards and the Avs. Yes, we actually did that. So I can't remember a time where I wasn't fully Black and fully Muslim, because our Eid barbecues were slapping at the park before dark, where our skate parties were the bomb, where we double Dutch jump rope and kimars, and where the elders played spades all day long. I still can't play spades. It's shameful, really. Anyway, through our parents' actions, I began to see just what their vision was and what our future could be. It was Black, it was Muslim, just like me. Now, that, I felt like sharing sort of like just the story poem about growing up. I thought about sharing that before I kind of get into just analyzing like, what does Black Muslim thought mean? What does Black Muslim joy look like? And what does all this mean, as resistance to anti-Black racism? And when I think about Black Muslim thought and Black Muslim joy and what that means, I think about how these concepts and practices are not new to me, and they're not new to the present moment. Now the terms themselves, Black Muslim thought, Black Muslim joy, and Black Lives Matter even, they may be very recent terminology, but they describe concepts and really values that are actually centuries old. And what I try to keep in mind is the fact that in the present moment, in the time of Black Lives Matter, these values are part of a continuum in the struggle against oppression. And I like to say that these are values and not just concepts and ideas, because in my own experience, particularly as a young girl, I was shaped by these values. Like these were values that like our parents had, that they had a deep belief and regard for. And it was lived, like just the idea of having Black Muslim thought, having your own sort of philosophy about how you approach Islam as someone who is of African descent, as someone whose ancestors were enslaved on this land. So these were lives, I knew about these from life experience before I knew like they were words, right? Or concepts and ideas. And they were reinforced in my community in ways that affirmed me and informed me of who I was and who we were as Muslims, but also as Black people who were approaching and living Islam. So I like to kind of get into sort of definitions so that people can we all can kind of be on the same page. So Black Muslim thought. Now I actually did consult with Google, so, but I'm happy to know that I know quite a few academics who happen to be Black people, who happen to be Muslim people, who are actually studying these concepts and these ideas, and they're studying our communities. So they have some great knowledge to contribute. And so when I was thinking about what does Black Muslim thought mean technically, like I know what that means through the actions of others in that approach, but I had to double check just to make sure. And certainly enough, that definition of what my lived experience and sort of this definition sort of are definitely in alignment. And so Dr. Yusuf Carter, he's a Black and Muslim anthropologist. He says that Black Muslim thought is the inherent politics through which Muslims of African descent have contributed to the building of religious institutions, movements, organizations that they've relied upon to articulate their varying ideological positions, and to provide educational and economic assistance, as well as religious training amongst and within their communities. So to me, what that sounds like and looks like really is best manifest in, I think, community life, right? And so I'm also someone who is interested in documentary as a discipline in media. And so I focus a lot on like, how do you show that? How do you show and tell like what something like this is? And for me, I think about just my experiences growing up in predominantly African-American Muslim communities. And they weren't all the same. And so that's part of this definition of like Black Muslim thought. There's a diversity in what it means to be a Black Muslim. And it's not just about place, whether you have immigrated or you're a newcomer or you're born here or you're, how many generations you kind of fall back on. Those things certainly inform that. But even amongst African-American Muslims, there was such a diversity in how we approached Islam. Certainly there were people whose lineage, their ancestors came out of the Nation of Islam movement. In my particular case, my parents were kind of young, I guess, considering the history of Black Muslims in the US. my parents, we did not come out of the Nation of Islam movement, although I believe all Muslims in the United States, and probably certainly also in the Western Hemisphere, North America in particular, that we have a connection to those earlier movements. But for my particular family history, we came out of the Dar Islam movement, which definitely I did not know that growing up. We just were Muslim, right? So I think even the explanation of just being Muslim is something that I can understand as an African American Muslim, whereas I think once I started to be in community with other Muslims from other, like backgrounds, whether they were, immigrants or from refugee backgrounds, the identifying as just Muslim, that I feel like that was just something that maybe African American Muslims kind of did. And I think that's also part of what Black Muslim thought is. Certainly there are different madhabs, and there are many different ways that people sort of approach Islam. And certainly I think we fell within a certain madhab, but it wasn't so emphasized. It was, we are Muslim, we believe in Allah, the angels, 5 pillars, 6 articles of faith, and that was pretty much the emphasis. It wasn't so much which madhab is this or that, or we look upon these people with suspicion. It was like, okay, you're a different type, you're Muslim, it's under this umbrella. So it was even the diversity of African American Muslims and how we sort of approached Islam. It opened the door for just being able to readily accept anyone who says that they're Muslim, at the end of the day. In terms of just the masjid community spaces, I think one example of what it looked like in terms of Black Muslim thought in action, because these are not necessarily just theories, but these are things that are like in action, right? Is that one example I can think of is in the masjid community space when we're all praying. In many of the Black American masjids that I have frequented and that I grew up in, there is sort of like the common space where everyone prays, men and women. And in some of those spaces, there are no physical partitions. There is an understanding that during prayer, people who identify as male, people who identify as female will pray, sort of with their gender. But there was no actual physical barrier. So you may have had like men sort of more in the front and women sort of in the back, but there was no actual physical barrier in some of these masjids. And I think one thing that I think about, and I've been thinking about for a while, especially just studying Black Muslim communities, is why that is, right? So, and sometimes what I think is this is part of the inherent politics that kind of go along with the definition of Black Muslim thought. So we have this approach, we have this history sort of before we were Muslim, right, as African Americans. And, in the US and in other parts of the world also, certainly, there was this anti-Black racism and discrimination. And if you think about what that meant for people for a couple of generations, literally in public space, Black people were relegated to the balcony seats in courtrooms or in movie theaters. Like in public space, Black people had a very particular spot. You could be entering through the back door, you could be coming, and your place was sort of in the balcony seats. But I think what happens with some African American Muslims and how they've approached Islam, when they are considering what their community spaces look like, certainly when they're approaching Islam, it's not we're not trading one sort of oppression for another, whatever this idea of oppression is, right? So if you have a lived experience of being oppressed and your people you all can only go to the balcony seats, or you can only enter through the back door. So people who, African Americans who are approaching Islam, for the most part, we're approaching Islam as a different avenue from like what they knew as white supremacy, right? So this other system, people are approaching it in a different way. And when you come into Islam and Islam is affirming your humanity as a human being, as a Black person, you're probably not going to sort of duplicate the things that you felt were harmful, right? So like, even though we may have the separation in terms of prayer space, but we're sort of all still together in a common area. So in the larger hall. So what I've seen for many years, and sort of the older or more established, like in terms of longevity, established African-American masters and communities is that that sort of doesn't exist. Like women are not necessarily like in the balcony area or not in the basement or coming in through the rear door, anything like that. And I think that has something to do with how African-Americans in our particular history in this country have approached Islam with that in mind. Something, I guess another example from my own home community is that my imam was a former Black Panther, Imam Jamil Alameen. He was also a community organizer from the 1960s. And so just with that, like he already came, and many of the people, my parents and other community elders, came with a very particular set of like politics and ideas. They love being Black, they love being Muslim. Like for them, they were people who converted to Islam, and this was something that they, you know, whether Allah chose them or they chose Islam, like, you know, but they approached this with these, like this zeal, you know, to sort of, and trying to figure out sort of incorporating both. And one thing that I think about in terms of safety in our communities, like for me, and I think this is totally an example of Black Muslim thought at play, right? What I knew about safety in our community had little to do with calling the police. Like the police were not who you call when you need help, you know? And the thing is that our communities were under surveillance as well, and, you know, from the state. And so that's a very particular type of violence. And so we, instead of, and I was very young, and these things were not like sort of explicitly like said. It was just an understanding that I feel safe in my community, even though there's these external forces, even though, and I was very aware as a child, and these things were not kept from us. We had this knowledge that like, yes, our community is under surveillance, but I don't know if it had to do with like having this childlike set of mind where you're like, okay, and you just kind of go play. But we had this understanding, but we also, I think for me in the community, it was still the safest place I've ever felt, being in my community. So I think it had less to do with just the idea and concept of safety and maintaining safety in your community, had less to do with sort of calling police, and more to do with sort of just being very vigilant, like people in our community, being very vigilant and shepherds for the community to sort of like maintain relationships with people, because not everyone was Muslim in our neighborhood, but certainly there was a Muslim presence in the neighborhood that helped make like everyone feel safe and maintain that safety. I think also something part of just growing up in a Black American Muslim community was the Friday khutbahs, you know, just sort of informing me in the community. We're part of a larger global community, so we were aware of like conflicts that are happening or just struggles that other Muslims are having, whether it was Bosnia, because I'm an 80s baby and grew up in the 90s, whether it was like Bosnia or Lebanon or Syria or Somalia, like different places, we had a connection to a global community. And, you know, me at the time having never traveled internationally, and just us being a bunch of African-American Muslims, we didn't have like very close personal relationships with people in these other places. But being a part of this global Muslim community and having a very particular set of politics, we knew that we were part of something bigger, right? But also at the same time, sort of our post-Juma Friday, like food was fried fish plates, right? It's a very Black thing to do. But that also reminded me that I'm also part of this very hyper-local, very Black community. Like we were not trading our Blackness to be whatever someone's idea of Muslim was like. You know, we were very Black and we were very Muslim. And I think some other things that I can kind of think about when it comes to just Black Muslim thought is just in my home life, right? So I talked about the community, and I talked about other Black Muslim communities, but in my own home, I think learning about sort of figures like Mansa Musa of Mali in West Africa, like these were bedtime stories for me, right? And learning about Mother Hagar and her being an African woman and just like her plight and her story and how she's positioned in our community and how we honor her by going to Hajj every year, right? Learning about, you know, prophets who were Black, like this is a thing, right? Like, so none of these were beyond my scope and imagination as a child, and having parents who, you know, and community members who affirmed my identity, you know, that was just like monumental for my development. And of course, we celebrated Malcolm X Day in our community at the neighborhood park every year. So that was also like a very, very like intentional thing to do. And these are things that we did because of the inherent politics. You know, the ability to name yourselves, the ability to build your own institutions, and the ability to sort of prioritize how you show up as a Muslim. And these things are not things that are just unique to Black people who are Muslim. You know, this is something that everyone does. And so this is a very sort of, it's a mirror, just a reflection, sort of just what every person has been doing. I think I'm gonna take another sip. I think now I'm gonna transition to talking about Black Muslim joy. So what is Black Muslim joy? Well, it's joy. It is joy. And it's, you know, in the face of anti-Black racism, it's a persistence and an insistence on creating joy. And specifically for me, it's creating those experiences, being surrounded by people who value me, who understand me, and who love and appreciate me. And as a child, what that looked like was sort of getting dressed up for Eid in like a green sequin scarf and matching green outfit and like going to eat prayer and hang out with my friends, but also going to like the neighborhood barbecue and seeing like the uncles and the boys in the community slaughter the goats. It was also like, you know, I mentioned in the story, you know, having Eid parties that, you know, where we would go to the skating rink and do that. Like these are really culturally, not specific, but, you know, there's a way that Black Muslims have approached it in order to sort of create joy. And those are things that I remember growing up with. And I know that earlier this month, I actually wrote a reflection piece in Sapelo Square. And for people who don't know what Sapelo Square is, it's a sort of digital platform that documents and produces the Black Muslim experience in the US. Lots of content, really great. But I started writing a reflection called Joy in the Times of Crisis. And I did that because I needed to process all the things that were happening at the time. So we got through, alhamdulillah, we got through like pandemic during Ramadan. So we completed Ramadan during a pandemic. Nothing I've experienced before, or probably many other people in our community. Had just heard about the murder of George Floyd. Like these things were happening really fast. And I really just kind of thought, and I was away from home, I was away from family, and I was away from my community. And I really needed to sort of sit with all these different things that were happening. And when I reflected on it, and I started to like write, and I started to realize like, hey, even in the moments that were really difficult and tough, you know, considering that in many places in the US, Black people are, you know, dying at higher rates from COVID-19, you know, just the institutional racism in healthcare systems sort of exacerbated our death rate. The fact that there's still Black men and women being shot and murdered in the streets by police and people who are police adjacent. All these different things happening. And of course, like this is sort of Ramadan and Eid and just sort of feeling displaced in some sort of way. But there's a lot of trauma. And the little things that I was able to do was during, you know, sheltering in place is FaceTiming my family and FaceTiming friends and trying to connect with people as best I can to create sort of some sort of sense of joy. And that's not something that it was really super like conscious for me. It was like, okay, I know it's Eid time. And even though I'm like disconnected from like physical family and like community, like, what do I know how to do? And the reason why I knew what and how to do it is because there was a precedence for it. Like, no matter what, I grew up in a community that these things were important. And I knew that there was a way that I could sort of create that for myself. And so alhamdulillah, like that worked out, you know, for a bit. But I was happy to go ahead and write that and just to kind of make sense of those feelings. Because it's a lot of trauma. It's a lot of trauma. And one thing I'll say is that Black people, which includes Black Muslims, we're more than our trauma. Everybody is. And certainly we experience trauma due to like violence of government surveillance of our communities, you know, like inadequate or no access to healthcare, carceral system, immigration detention, like, you know, school to prison pipeline, you name it. You know, centuries of violent anti-Black rhetoric and actions, like these have lasting impacts on our lives. But for me, it was like, this is a reality, right? But it was also important for me to know and to be reminded myself that we're more than the sum of our oppression, right? And the sum of violence, anti-Black racism, violence that is inflicted on us. And that's whether it's in the Muslim community or outside of the Muslim community. So, you know, oftentimes like those things, you can think of your community, your Muslim community as being sort of a safe haven, because honestly, like, I grew up that way, right? But then sometimes you're experiencing anti-Black racism at the same time when you're entering like different Muslim spaces. And so that, in addition to just being Black in the world, can be quite a bit. And sometimes that's hard to sort of, like, it's not an easy burden to bear. Certainly not like alone, which is why I am grateful for having community and being part of community. And I think that's really how we survive. That's how we thrive. So I guess now I'm going to transition into sort of Black Lives Matter, right? So it's definitely an organization. It was founded by 3 brilliant women, Black women, in 2013. Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, Opal Tometi. So, and they founded this organization in sort of a response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer. So it's been 6 years, which it seems longer, right? But from that traumatic loss was born this organization that focused on movement building against state violence and vigilante violence against Black people. And part of their mission is to create space for Black imagination and innovation and centering Black joy. So even in movement building, even in our movement building, like these themes of joy and having imagination sort of use, I'm thinking about Black Muslim thought, right? Like actually have imagination to create the spaces that you need to thrive. And so I see so many parallels there, right? But even if you're not familiar with the organization, Black Lives Matter is also a positive affirmation, right? It's a demand. It is a political statement. For some people, it's a meditation, right? And again, just given the reality of anti-Black racism in the US and in the world, sometimes Black Lives Matter, just the statement itself it feels like an aspiration because we're not there yet, right? And so this is something that I kind of think about for people who are not necessarily, or maybe they're new to movement building and being in certain spaces. One thing I like to do is just try to connect these ideas. Like these are ideas that in themselves are just way older, centuries older, right? And so there's a historic context for Black Lives Matter, right? It's something that sort of in practice, Black people have been asserting, certainly for the past 500 years, that our lives matter, right? In the context of like North America or even the Western Hemisphere enslavement, right? So Black people fighting for their liberation and their freedom, Black Lives Matter is an assertion, right? And as Muslims, you know, truly, if we believe Allah says be and it is, then also God has confirmed and affirmed Black people quite a long time ago, right? Because it's Black life. It is a life, right? And even 1,400 years ago, right? Just to kind of catch things up a bit, for those of us who are familiar with the Prophet, alayhi salam's like last sermon, the spirit of that message, that Black lives matter and that Black people have value is very clear, right? And I think about just now, sort of in the present moment, Black lives matter as a practice. So it is something sort of to create the world anew, right? And it takes radical imagination and organizing. And I'd like to offer some ways that Black Muslims are doing this through organizations. So one example is Believers Bailout. And this is an organization where people are literally freeing Muslims from detention, whether it is sort of jail or it's like immigration detention. Muslim ARC is another organization, Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative. they address racism within the Muslim community. So they have so much programming going on that is really like toolkits, all kinds of things, like courses, classes, like you name it. Zappo Square, they document Black Muslim life in the US, and they do that through arts and culture, history, politics, and different things. So there's so many different tools and ways that Black Muslims are sort of reimagining and doing work and organizing, whether it's through media and arts, whether it's through like mutual aid funds, whether it's educational tools to like unlearn, knowledge. There's quite a few resources out there. But I think also if we are in community and we're doing this work, it means that we're listening to the people whose lives are most impacted by anti-Black racism. And we're trusting them to lead those conversations and to create those solutions. And it also means that if we seek to be in community and build in solidarity, it also means that we have to know ourselves. We have to know where we stand internally. And I think that is like the critical work to do. And you have to continue to do it. It's self-work, but it's also the part of the greater struggle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bashirah.
Thank you.
That was really great. And thank you for sharing your experiences on being very Black and very Muslim. So now we will split into breakout rooms. And in these breakout rooms, we can discuss the takeaways and what we learned together. And when we reconvene, we will share the 3 questions that we brainstormed into the larger group to ask Bashirah. So yeah, I think Aslam can now split the screen if he has access to it.
Yeah, so I'll make the breakout rooms. If for any reason you don't want to be in that particular breakout room, or you don't want to be in a breakout room at all, maybe you just want to process by yourself, that's okay as well. So you'll get an invitation to join a breakout room, so you can accept that or not accept that. I think the breakout rooms are randomly assigned, so also if you'd like to be in a specific breakout room, you can just come back to the main room and then I can reassign you from there. So we'll be in the breakout rooms until, let me just check my times quickly, 7:10. So just over, just under 20 minutes in those rooms, or just under 30 minutes in those rooms. So we'll be back at 7:10, inshallah. And we might also just like drop into some of those rooms to check if that time still makes sense, or if you'd like it to have more time in the larger group, then we can also do that as well. So we'll keep messaging you in the large chat room if necessary. Okay, we'll see you soon, inshallah. So group 1. So in that group was Abdullah, Alicia, Mohammed, Farnaz, Manar, Nasreen. Questions from your group?
Hi, yeah, Manar was sharing. She's coming from Chicago suburbs. So she was asking kind of how to create a sense of community, even with those who aren't similar to us. And in her context, her community is not majority Muslim, and she doesn't have a strong connection with her neighbors. So yeah, we're all coming from such different contexts where some of us do have communities more similar to us or not. So yeah, she was wondering any ideas for that.
My best attempt at answering that. I think it may also maybe depend on just your level of comfort, right? So some people may be more introverted, some people more extroverted. For extroverted people, maybe it's easier for them to kind of just go out and like create community, talk people up, look people up, and start conversations that way. For people who are more introverted, which I can kind of move between those spaces myself. I think for me, what I've done is so I grew up in a very particular community where people were like me, right? But I also come from sort of a larger extended family where people were not Muslim, right? So I think early on, I got a chance to kind of move between different sort of spaces with people who are Muslim and people who are not Muslim, people who were not Black, being in the Muslim community and part of broader communities. you just get like, I've thought of diversity as being like a beautiful thing, right? But maybe just kind of stepping out. I mean, we're in a pandemic also, so it's kind of hard for me to kind of think about this in, you know, previous ways. But just finding people who have some sort of similarity to you. And maybe it's networking events. Maybe it's, you know, I find people online actually. I follow accounts on Twitter. I live there. Not so much Facebook, but you know, just finding people that you might, maybe it's their work, maybe they're artists, maybe they're musicians. I don't know if the person has kids, maybe it's a mom's group, you know, things like that. Or maybe you're a pet parent, you know, just finding some sort of similarity with people. And maybe like there are online spaces, right? One thing for me, I realized like during all this pandemic and being sheltered in place, I may be separated physically from community, but when I want to and need to, I can kind of pop in on some of these like virtual spaces, whether it's people are doing like organized events like this. And then afterwards, you're kind of like, oh, I like what this person had to say. Maybe you kind of reach out to them afterwards. Or you're just doing part of a larger network of friends where maybe you don't know some people as well as you thought you did, and maybe that's an opportunity to sort of reach out, or even just leaning into the friendships that you already have and the relationships that you already have, and asking them like, "Hey, help me out! Like, I want to sort of broaden my community, and think of ways to do that. I mean, I don't know, maybe there's also like, I'm thinking like old school, like trivia nights, like doing some sort of digital trivia night thing where it's just you're finding some sort of commonality with people, and you're just kind of taking the steps from there to try to like build and maintain relationships with people. And if someone is really different than you, and I don't know if like kind of how this is kind of like, I mean, I've seen examples of people who they want to be in sort of an ally to a certain like ethnic demographic group of people, and their way of thinking they should do that is, I need to have like a Black friend, right? And like, I would say, no, that's not how you should do that. Because, I mean, that like, it's like just checking your sort of intention, right? Like, do you want to have that one Black friend? Or like, are you genuinely interested in like what this person has to say, what they have to offer in terms of relationship or friendship? Do you like their personality, Because at the end of the day, anybody kind of, like, again, like nobody wants to be a token anything. But if there's like a genuine interest, like maybe it's dance class. Again, I'm thinking like pre-pandemic. Like I like salsa, and I was like, I don't know any actual people who do that, but like there's a free event like downtown, and I'm just gonna go. And I met a lady, and we just started dancing. I was like, all right, cool. But again, like it just there's a lot of factors.
Thank you very much. I think also in the interest of time, if people have questions, and also for those who are processing by themselves, like feel free to drop them in the chat, and maybe we can pick some up from there as well. I think nobody from Breakout Room 2 joined their Breakout Room. They were all processing alone. So Breakout Room 3, Bashirah was in that group, but Nida, Oromia, Yara, any questions or reflections that came up from you? Or Bashirah, feel free to like give a summary or recap if you'd like as well.
I would like to maybe give whoever from our conversation would like to share something. If not, then I can give a summary, but if there's anybody that wants to. Well, I can give a summary. So I think I had about 3 questions. One of them asked about maybe I remember 2, asked about just sort of experiences of maybe anti-Black racism in the Muslim community. And I think like for me, I mentioned that some of it just wasn't like very explicit. It wasn't someone calling me a name. I mean, in Urdu, there's a word, and in Arabic, there's a word, but I didn't have a direct experience with people calling me like some name that was inappropriate, but it was more so like carrying an assumption about who I was and who I was not. So it sounded like people who may not have been Black or Muslim asking, or maybe not have been Black American and Muslim, asking me, oh, did you convert? And so that's a question that I think so many African Americans get, that the assumption in itself tends to lean sort of like racist, because there's an assumption of like who this person is and what does Muslim or someone who's born Muslim look like? And for some reason, outside of other people's imagination, that person could not be me. And so, you know, and I respond with, well, it's funny that people ask that, because for the longest time of my own personal life, the only Muslims I really knew intimately looked exactly like me. Like, I had an entire community of people. There were like hundreds of kids, right? Because, you know, and like several different types of African American Muslim communities. And also just, you know, for our own sort of knowledge and history about who we are as Muslims, especially in North America, the first Muslims in North America were Black Muslims. They look like me, like the first. So when we think about sort of our Muslim ancestors in this part of the world, they are people, I am the descendant of those people. And if we sort of seriously consider, you know, our broader Muslim community and part of our lineage, then also anyone who is migrating to North America, this is the history and this is the legacy that you are inheriting also as Muslim. That was a question and I answered in that way.
That's cool. Maybe we can go to breakout room 4 is Michelle and Rasha, and then we can go to Arthur in 5. And then maybe breakout room 6, that's Ayan, Aliv, Hala, Sabat, and Suzanne. If you've got questions, then you can also maybe start preparing those in the meantime.
Assalamu alaikum. I can go for our group. Firstly, thank you, Jazakallah khair, Bashir, for the talk. It was very beneficial and insightful. We talked about a few things. We had a few questions. Maybe I'll just ask the first one for now. So one that we had was, how has your family preserved Islam throughout history, facing that oppression? And is there any ways that you continue to preserve Islam, facing that oppression as Black Muslims?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think just in my own family's history, I think one thing that I think has been like really beneficial is just this idea of storytelling. So my father is someone who, he is probably the family oral historian. He has all these great stories and he tells stories really well. And I'm just trying to do it as like a, you know, it's in my profession, but he's like a natural, oh my God. But, you know, I'm grateful that he had this knowledge passed down to him and he was able to pass it down to me. And so that we had this connection at a very young age of like our family background having some connection to Islam before my father converted. So my mother and my father are people who converted to Islam, and their broader extended families are mostly Christian identifying people. But prior to that, my father explained that we have like great-great-grandmother who lived to be over 100 years old, that he knew very well. There were certain things, certain habits, certain just behaviors that it was just something that they would do that he didn't necessarily, before he became Muslim, he didn't necessarily like think of that in a very particular way. It was just like, oh, that's just what, you know, the old generation does. So like taking your shoes off when you enter a home, right? Or like having like beads that you're praying with. Even certain like words and phrases, just because my family comes from a very particular part of the United States and we have a very particular history in South Carolina on the coast. In the history of the United States, at least 30% of the people who were enslaved in the US were Muslim, right? So you had 1 in 3 people, you know, on a slave ship were Muslim, right? So you got your La ilaha illallah traveling across the sea, coming to this place in North America, and your people are here. During this sort of system of oppression and slavery, when someone is selling your child off to God knows where, like, typically speaking, you're able to raise your family, you're able to pass down stories, you're able to pass down knowledge, you're able to pass down traditions to your kids, and they take that on, right? When your family unit is destroyed and you are sort of displaced from and sold off to, you know, your kids are sold off somewhere else, who do you pass that knowledge on to? And for the kids who have been sold off in slavery, where do they learn that? How are they going to have that knowledge of self? Like, how are they going to know like what to do as a Muslim? So there was a huge disruption of, you know, just people who are African descent who were Muslim, and just that proliferation and practice of Islam. So that is a reality, you know, and part of that is also Black people were forced into Christianity in some ways. You know, but at the same time, there were people who persisted still, right? They were literate, who were Hafiz Quran, everything. Like they had this knowledge. They wrote stuff down. There are manuscripts from people in Georgia, people who were enslaved in Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, that like just Arabic script, right? Like, and this stuff is out there. This knowledge is out there. But there's certain things and habits that no matter what, people still sort of pass down. And if you live in sort of communities where there were other people who were enslaved, even maybe if perhaps your kids were sold off, you still belong to sort of a community of people. And so not everything was taken from us. And I think that's sort of like how I come to know, or at least kind of understand that, people even sort of had language. I think a few generations before me, English was not their, native language at all. And so people also had to like learn this new language, but they still had the language that they spoke, their native language or remnants of it. And so certain words even that have entered American lexicon, right, are actually like have Arabic root words or come from West African languages, and like how we understand like what these words mean have like some very different roots, right? So there's been ways that people have been able to sort of preserve the bits and pieces of what it was to be Muslim, whatever that knowledge was, and just transferring it and transmitting it, and even trying to document and save it in some ways. And I think just, I guess part of me being a descendant of those people, it makes sense to me that really we're probably just somebody else's prayer, like where our ancestors' prayers manifest, right? Like this is something that throughout this horrible oppression and generations of it, like we're still able to sort of turn back to Islam, and people were able to do that. So part of it is just having this belief that like this was Allah's plan, but also understanding just how, as human beings and, generationally, some knowledge and some cultural practices and some things are still sort of passed down and still survive, even some of the harshest experiences. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
And I think it also goes towards answering the question that Sosan asked in the chat group. As Canadian Muslims, how do we deal with historical revisionism in the community? So Canada talks about the Underground Railroad, but neglects to talk about Halifax's slavery in Canada and Muslim countries. And then Hala answered in the chat box as well that there's a local group re-educating themselves by reading Robin Maynard's book, Police and Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to the Present. And that group, there's a link in the chat box to find more about that reading group. So I think it's like through these reading groups and as you were sharing, like through storytelling as well, that this history can be retold and corrected according to how it actually happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And there's some interesting there's some interesting documentaries. One thing I think I grew up on PBS and stuff like that, as public broadcasting in the US, but I grew up on those types of things, lots of documentaries, and a lot of things that are based in history, which sort of also just part of my personal interest. But I think that there's communities that exist sort of, I mean, they mentioned like Halifax, which I know is in Nova Scotia. Like there's communities of Black people who, were enslaved there and also free there. And those communities, the descendants still exist. So I think also maybe just, if at all possible, trying to connect with maybe those local people, whether they have like their own like oral histories, whether they have, what do they call it? Here, we have like, what do they call it? Neighborhood archives and things like that. And maybe some of that stuff's, maybe there's some academics that have studied these things. So sometimes it's because someone was really interested in something very, very specific and they kind of also did some research on it. I think we're getting a lot of knowledge. Like I had a lot of oral history growing up and just having that sort of direct link, but there's also so many people who are like scholars who are going out and trying to like make sense of and prove like new theories and new knowledge. So that's also something that could be really, really interesting and important. And it's also like these borders are modern, like they're modern constructions. I do know actually that the imam of my community, his wife, her family, and she's African American, but her family at some point were in Canada. They were they left from upstate New York and they went to Canada because it was better for Black people at that time, and then they came back. So, you know, people have been moving also and migrating throughout these histories.
We are running a little bit low on time, but I think I can offer, if folks want to leave at 7:30, they can, but we can also keep going a bit longer, if that's okay with you, Bashirah, and whoever else wants to stay. Like we say, these spaces of connection are not that common, and it's good to kind of take advantage while we have them. Maybe I can just go to like Hala, Ayan, Sabat, and just also trying to center the voice of Black Muslims in this conversation as well.
So I'm looking at, oh, is anybody speaking, or, because I'm kind of looking at the chat also.
Look at the chat and I can speak. It's all good. So now I go to the So my question was around what you spoke to when you were speaking on trauma, and that not being the sum of our existence, and the oppressions that we face not being the sum of our existence. And so many times when we talk about victims of any sort of oppression, that victimization becomes the sum of their identity. And that manifests itself not only in the ways that we identify ourselves, but that we are identified by systems, whether they're government or not. And so my question is around that, if you could speak more about that and what joyful resistance to that looks like.
I think it's really hard, right? So we don't exist in vacuums, and there's always so many things kind of pushing and pulling our various identities. But I think for me, being able to reflect on my past experiences helped me to understand and realize and be reminded that, okay, this is crazy for sure, but also there has been joy in my life that had nothing to do with being like in response or reaction to or in resistance to anybody's racism, right? And one thing that I can appreciate about part of my experience being Black and Muslim and going to communities and different massages in our community is that also our leadership also understood that and reflected that. I remember specifically a khutbah where Imam was saying, like, our identity as like our primary identity is human being, right? Like, sure, we're Black, but our primary identity is that of a human being. And so that reminder in itself is, no matter what sort of oppression that we're facing, and because of someone else's like idea about who we are and what they think we are or what they think we deserve, that is their problem, not really ours, right? Like, our focus has to be, and our understanding of ourselves has to be, that our primary identity is that we're human beings, and then we're Muslim, and then we're Black, right? Those things all exist together. But I think in the reality, right, we're going about our day-to-day, of course, you're experiencing so many like different oppressions at once. If you're Black, if you are, you know, a Muslim who's, you know, refugee, if you're undocumented, if you're a woman, like, there's so many different ways that our identity can be weaponized against us. But I think having to sort of dig deeper into my own personal experiences, and to know that there was a time, it's like this remembrance, like this memory. There was a time before when I was just seeking joy and being joyful and experiencing joy. And it wasn't a response, it wasn't a reaction, right? It's important to be able to claim joy and create joy when you need to, even if it is in resistance. But there's also, like, you have to like know and remind yourself, you're a full human being. You are definitely more than some of like your experiences of repression against you. So I think it's just sort of this constant reminder and reaffirmation, and surrounding yourself with people who also can affirm you and support you in those ways. Just being like, just living as best you can. So I think that's been really helpful to me, just being able to lean into those previous experiences, being able to sort of like check myself, and also not being ashamed of, okay, these multiple experiences were really harmful and really toxic and really impactful on me. And how can I create like the situation or the experience that I need to kind of pull myself out of this. And not everybody is able to do that. Sometimes you need therapists. Like sometimes you need like, I don't know, Ben and Jerry, like whatever. Sometimes you need like an extra push. But I think just having sort of digging into this memory and to know that when things are not right, like you have like sort of a plan, like something that you fall back on, like, here's how I can get better again, right? So I don't know if that really completely answers your question, but I think for me, it's always about sort of just memory and kind of going back to previous experiences that did not sort of reflect the negativity.
Yeah, no, it's a really great starting point for me to think about these things, and I can't help but think about the importance of remembrance in Islam in general, and that the word dhikr has to do with remembrance. And so, yeah, I'm really grateful for that. Like, that there was a time before time. I really appreciate that. And I have follow-up questions, but I think there's some other questions as well, so I'll leave them for later.
Thank you for your question.
I was just wondering, I had a question about, I initially had a question about how you encountered, like, being in, like, predominantly Black Muslim spaces when you encountered, like, anti-Black racism within Muslim communities. And another question I was wondering, and, like, maybe you could pick either or, whatever you think, is why, if you've also noticed how like some, like, well, I guess this is predominantly has been discussed about like non or white like convert scholars, about how they can kind of navigate space in Muslim, and predominantly men can navigate space in Muslim communities where they're kind of like, or navigate space in scholarly space, academic spaces, where they're like, where their interpretations of Islam and of this Islamic law, theology, etc., are perceived as more legitimate. Like, I was wondering if you've also noticed that, if you have any thoughts on that. Yeah.
So maybe I'll start with the second question because it's the freshest one. Yes, the answer is yes, I have noticed that. So prior to me kind of coming into journalism, I spent almost 5 years doing social media for Sapelo Square for the site, which meant like I saw all of the drafts, I read all the stories, everything that we published, I had my eyes on. I had to know what that information was. So there was quite a few articles that were written, some interviews that were done, video recordings of just that very topic, right? Like addressing anti-Black racism within sort of this, like, I don't know what they call it. I don't want to say like bros club of scholars, but like just, you know what I mean, right? The celebrity imam, scholar sheikhs and all these people. And just so there were so many different conversations happening, and I got a chance to sort of like be witness to that and to read and to sort of like struggle with those things, those ideas. But also I remember, again, like I had this whole different experience growing up, right? Like our imam was a very different person, and like the elders and the people, like I was an 80s baby, right? I grew up in the 90s. We had being Muslim like in 1990s and early 2000s was maybe a different experience, right? Like it wasn't like this whole celebrity shade phenomenon thing, right? And so I'm thankful for having that other experience as well, to be able to sort of judge like, hey, yes, this thing is problematic, right? And there's definitely a way in a culture that has changed and shifted. And yes, you do see some, like, I mean, I probably can't name them all because I get my knowledge where I get my knowledge. And so I may not like actually listen to some of these people that are coming out, but there definitely is sort of this idea, even within our communities, right? Because we're also colonized people, right? And that takes some undoing. Like that's a process. That's a process. And so some people may take a sheikh who studied at wherever, and just the sheer fact that not even proximity to whiteness, but you are legitimately, you're white, right? And that is just a phenomenon that continues to persist. I mean, I pray and I hope that people more people are conscious about that and more critical about that, and even whatever those messages are. I mean, certainly there's some people who maybe what they're saying, their knowledge base is not problematic, and it does affirm, and it is in alignment with Quran and Sunnah and the things that should be said of Muslims and about Muslims. But then there are some people who don't, and those messages have been talked about in our communities and called out in our communities. And I pray they continue to be, because anyone in a leadership position, if they are saying things that are anti-Black or misogynist or anything else, that does harm in our communities beyond just, the face value, right? Does harm more than just the people who are on the receiving end, but it also does harm to people who believe that and then sort of proliferate those messages as well. What was the other question?
Oh, it was about when you describe how you grew up in Black Muslim spaces, when you encountered anti-Black racism from non-Black Muslims / I guess the wider Muslim community in your experience.
I think growing up, I don't think I had a very direct experience with anti-Black racism within the Muslim community, but I knew about it, which is interesting, right? The aunties they're not talking to me, they're talking to each other, but you hear oh, they don't like Black people, as a child, you think oh, I'm Black, that doesn't make any sense. Someone doesn't like me because I'm Black. That's a hard thing to even accept. You didn't meet me yet. You don't know if I suck, right? Just that is a weight that, just being a kid, you hear it and you're oh, okay. That doesn't give you a lot of room for people to kind of make other decisions and choices about who you are, But so there was some sort of consciousness, right, that other communities felt a type of way. But I had my community that was affirming of me. And yes, we had maybe one Arab family in our community. We had an auntie who was Pakistani who married an African-American brother, and we had a white auntie. We had aunties who were Latina, Dominican. We had a little peppering of other folks in our community, but they also sort of they were of our community, right? They carried a similar politic and way, that they wanted to approach Islam. So me moving out of those spaces, so I would say perhaps college, right? I actually left home. I left the Southeast. I moved to the Midwest. Chicago happens to have a very different history. People talk about the South, but Chicago is something else. And so I think that was for me also because Atlanta is very Black, right? Racism still exists and the system of white supremacy still exists for sure. But it's the rich people are Black, the poor people are Black, the Muslims are Black, the Jews are Black, the police are Black. There was a different sort of dynamic, right? Leaving that space and going to college, being in Chicago, larger immigrant population of Muslims, so you have people from all over, and I thought that was a positive and a plus. But actual interactions, some were positive and some were negative. Some were quite negative. But I think at the same time, I was very sure of myself. I had been Muslim by the time I came to Chicago. I was 21, right? That's an adult, right? And I've been Black and Muslim my entire 21 years at that point, right? So I didn't have a problem being in a different space and questioning my own, identity as a Muslim. That was, but it was also because I had the experience that I had, right? It's not to say that those things didn't hurt when I did, experience them, but I was able to push back. I knew whatever someone's idea was about Black people in general, and it wasn't to say, oh, because you're Muslim, you're different, right? No, those are my people too, right? We're all Black here. And any ideas or thoughts that you have negatively about Black people, they also affect me. There's no, because I'm Muslim, all of a sudden I'm not Black anymore. That was never the case. So yeah, I mean, I've had those experiences, but I've, I felt good and right within my own identity and my own network. And I knew how to seek out people the communities that I wanted to be a part of. So you know, I was able to do that, alhamdulillah. And Chicago has, I mean, even before I moved here, I was like, okay, Chicago has Black people and Muslims, and some of those Muslims are Black people. So I felt I can create community wherever I go, and inshallah, I'll be fine. That was the hope that I had. And alhamdulillah, like, I was here for like 12 years, so it worked out. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, I think whoever has another question, maybe just like unmute yourself. I'm not sure, or you can use the raise hand functions or chat, put in the chat box, whatever feels good.
If I can ask a follow-up question to the answer that you gave me, it's interesting that you talked about your imam, I believe it was your mom, who centered humanness as like the root of our identities as human beings. And to me, that's really interesting because we talk about race being a construct. We talk about like our Blackness being created in contrast to whiteness, or vice versa. And that's not to say that we are erasing the importance of those, like that terminology. But how do you go about doing that? How do you go about not erasing what Blackness really, really is in a very like tangible way, and at the same time affirming aspects of our identity that are not seen, that perhaps we feel are more deeply rooted? What does that look like for you?
If I understand your question, it's, I'm sorry, can you repeat it once more? Like break down the first part.
Yeah, I think basically what I'm asking is, what does racial deconstruct, like if we think of race as a construct, what does that deconstruction look like in terms of our terminology? And it might be like outside of the scope of this discussion, but it's something that I've been thinking of.
That's a deep question. I don't know if, I personally don't know if like, so decolonization, I believe in, right? I don't know if we even should sort of deconstruct race, right? And like for me, and I say this to people, right? It's just especially journalists, because sometimes they really get the language wrong around race and racism. I often say like, I don't really care about someone's race. Like I care about racism, right? Like race being an acknowledgement that, okay, one, there's a human race, but also, yes, there's like real life implications for how people who are racialized like exist and navigate in the world, right? You know, impacts on our health, our livelihood, all types of things, right? So I don't know so much if my focus is to deconstruct this idea of race, because it's also, to me, kind of important. Not that I necessarily, I mean, it's just, to me, it's just a fact. Like, it doesn't mean, me being Black doesn't mean that I'm ignorant or poor or whatever. And it also doesn't, like, you know, there's stereotypes about people who are not Black that they might be positive stereotypes, but they also probably not a whole, you know, 100% true, right? So I don't necessarily know if like deconstructing race itself versus like being in opposition to racism, right? And what racism is, which to me are different conversations. And I think oftentimes in the journalism world, they kind of like just lump it all together. It's race, but it's like, well, no, it's not right. It's racism that you want to address. It's racism, right? Like that is the problem. Somebody being white in and of itself is not a problem for me, you know, like whatever, like Allah created, that kind of thing, right? It's when you create privileges or you deny people like their human rights or their civil rights or any of these things, right? That based on their racial identity, that is the problem for me. So I think for me, it's more of like just deconstructing just the colonized mind and also just fighting against oppression in general. And I don't necessarily, that's not really something I thought about, like just the idea of deconstructing race. And I also don't know who that might serve. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I totally hear you. And it was really good for me to hear you like separate the two, because as soon as I hear that something is constructed, then I think, oh, perhaps it can be deconstructed. And what does that look like? and I know people across time and space have groups, in groups and out groups. And what does that look like in terms of how we treat the out group and how we treat the in group? And I think that's what you're getting at, that subtlety of like the difference between race, deconstructing race, should we even do that? And then deconstructing racism, which is an effect of the construct of race. So I appreciate the subtlety. Thank you.
And if I may ask a quick question to Bashirah. So what has your experience been like as a Muslim among the non-Muslim Black community? Any troublesome, any anti-Muslim feelings you experienced there, or yeah?
That's a good question. Yes. Like the answer is yes. I only laugh because I'm thinking about, like, I mean, so I went to public schools. The only private school I've ever been to was when I went to college, and it was a Jesuit institute. But I went to public schools, just neighborhood schools, and in our neighborhood was predominantly African American, but most of the people in our broader community neighborhood were not Muslim at all, which is true for most places, right? Like, I'm in America. But I mean, like, that was like in schools the first time someone pulled my scarf off, and so I had experiences like that. But also, even going through some of those situations, there were other Muslim kids also at my school, and I also had like a brother. So there was still a sense that like we all kind of came together. And I think that's something that I'm really thankful for, just having that type of community. So whatever my parents, friends, they had like a bunch of kids, parents had a bunch of kids, like the kids grew up together. There was a sense of like shared identity, and that, yes, we exist in this broader, communities, whether we're Muslim, whether we're in Black spaces, and wherever our identities may be challenged, wherever we may face some difficulties, like we have each other, right? So, I mean, yeah, I think that's probably, and that happened maybe twice, like that's probably the most that I've experienced, which that can be very traumatic, right? As a Muslim girl. But I think that was probably maybe about the most that I've had. I mean, I think even just being African American and Muslim, where even in our extended families, some people, like many people, are not Muslim. And so I can't say that I've personally had any tension or any explicit sort of like, because they're Muslim, side of the family or whatever. I can't say that I had that experience, but I do know from family stories that, when my mom converted to Islam, like there was some tension between her and her family initially, or at least maybe her and her mother. But that didn't sort of impact the relationship we were able to have with our grandmother. So I think with that, it's just sort of this knowledge that people have to adjust, they have to adjust if they want to be in your life in that way. And I think certainly for my family, adjustments were made because there's like, it's 5 of us. And so, it was an opportunity for my grandmother to know her grandkids and just to love us. And I can't say that I had any negative experiences directly, but I think just, a generation prior, it may have been some resistance or just not understanding, like, what is this, right? Like Muslim, I think, at a time where people, maybe they didn't know a lot of Muslims in general and they didn't know like what that meant. So it was, people having to learn. I mean, and I have friends who are from my community that probably had like different experience altogether, so sometimes those things do exist even within sort of like a family unit. But I think for myself on the whole, like it's been generally positive. And again, I think just for Black families, I don't know, like every family has a different dynamic. We were all just family. So,
Okay, Jazakallah khair.
Thank you so much. I think it's coming close to the top of the hour, and to ask people to be on Zoom for 2 hours is quite an ask after a long day, I'm sure. But I think at this point it would be good for us to just kind of like bring something off the close. And what I can do is just leave this chat room open and maybe like hand over the hosting responsibilities to Hala or something like that. And then if people want to stick around and chat some more, then they can do that. When we hosted the Being Black and Muslim Dialogue a couple of years ago, that conversation carried on for well into the night. Yeah, I think based on everything that you've shared, just again, thank you. The perspective of like it's multi-generational, these things have been happening for a long time, they will continue to happen, that there's a lot of work that non-Black Muslims need to do in recognizing not only like the current anti-Black racism that exists within the community, but also the trauma and the history that comes with that, in addition to many other things, right? Like as men and as people of certain class backgrounds, etc. And also I think just to create that framework of joy and like collective liberation, I think I also really appreciate bringing that into the conversation that sometimes feels very stark and like quite depressing, and like, is there a way out and how are we going to move forward with this? So I will hand over back to Nisreen and Arisha to close up. I've received just a message privately that maybe after 8 o'clock we can just make the space for Black Muslims to connect. So if you're not Black and Muslim, please log out at 8 if that feels good. And if anyone has any other conversations, feel free to just send me a message or whatever it is to clarify that. So back to Arisha and Nisreen to kind of close us out for the evening.
First of all, thank you to everyone for coming and supporting our event. We hope that you learned something valuable and you took something away from this. Just to wrap up, please feel free to again check out our social medias, which is Open City Events, and we hold a lot of similar events like this. If you have any feedback, we would love to hear it. And yeah, feel free to contact us on any of our platforms. Again, this event would not have been possible without CCMS, so thank you for them for partnering us on this event. And thank you so much for Bashirah for coming on and sharing your experiences and allowing us to just learn and take everything in. Thank you.
Okay, that's all. Again, thank you from our side, and we'll be in touch soon, inshallah.
Thank you, everybody.
Jazaak khair.
Assalamu alaikum. Have a good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.